Welcome everyone to Citizens Climate University. Tonight we're very lucky to have our own chair of the board, Dr. Ross Astoria, with us to discuss international trade law and border carbon adjustments. Ross comes by way of a PhD and a JD, a dual degree at UC Berkeley, and is now the chair of the board of directors for Citizens Climate Lobby and a professor of politics, philosophy, and law at the University of Wisconsin in Parkside. And at this point, just a quick review before beginning on tonight's learning goals. Hopefully after the lesson, everyone should be able to describe the trade law disciplines which configure the design of a border carbon adjustment, and also have the chance to identify some data sets on trade, emissions, and energy that'll help you get more hands-on and really understanding what this might look like, as well as having the chance to prepare and conduct an outreach plan for stakeholders back home in your own district who need to understand the details of a border carbon adjustment. So what a wonderful set of goals. The agenda as fourth is looking like having treaties and the background in the GATT, followed by more discussion about tariffs and most favored nation status, as well as the national treatment within GATT. Ross is then going to have a chance to jump into general exceptions and how to actually process a dispute resolution should one arise with our border carbon adjustment, talk about custom unions, free trade areas, fossil fuel considerations, along with carbon intensive products. And then we'll end hopefully with about 15 to 20 minutes of time to really dive in for questions, which I know is probably what brought a lot of people on tonight, to have a little bit more of a chance for Q&A with Ross. So we'll even see if we can get that quicker. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ross, and we are all waited with bated breath to learn from you about border carbon adjustments. Thanks again for being here tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for setting the expectations so high. Just kind of intro here. Why is the border carbon adjustment important? So who cares? This is the results. In this slide, you see the results of our efforts when we met with congressional members, I think 2 years ago now. And Danny siphoned through all the reports that we put in, and we get some fantastic data from that about what Congress is concerned about. And from that, you can see that there are quite a number of members of Congress who brought up, either as a question or concern, or suggested focusing on it, either something to do with China, the WTO, or the border. So there are people, in fact, asking questions about the border carbon adjustment. And before I go any further, I will also note that recently in the Congress, there was a consideration of something called a border adjustment with respect to the GOP tax reform plan. And so we've started calling what Citizens Climate Lobby is doing a border carbon adjustment, to try to distinguish it from just the border adjustment, while also not necessarily using the word tax. So hopefully one thing that we'll get through here is some sufficient amount of clarity on a border carbon adjustment, that when our members of Congress ask us, how does this differ from a border adjustment that we saw last year, you'd be able to give some specifics there. So, all right, so here's the general outline of what the border carbon adjustment there. So that red line there just to the right in the middle of the screen is representative of the US border. Nice, straight, impenetrable. And you see some goods passing back and forth. So one thing that the border carbon adjustment does is it distinguishes between three types of products. On the one hand, you have carbon intensive goods or products, and we'll define that a little later. You have fossil fuels, and then you have other types of products which are neither fossil fuels nor carbon intensive goods. And so when carbon intensive goods or fossil fuels are imported, the border carbon adjustment will be levied upon those two products. And when carbon intensive goods are exported from the United States, they will receive a rebate of carbon prices paid domestically, in the anticipation, however, that those exported carbon intensive goods will have levied upon them some sort of carbon price by the country of importation on a border carbon adjustment. So one thing to note here is, I think probably everyone on this call is aware that the United States is a member of the World Trade Organization, and a part of the World Trade Organization family of treaties, I like to call them, is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And so our main objective here will be to kind of go through some elements of the GATT to see where to see where a border carbon adjustment will fit into that trade agreement. Okay, so first thing to note here is the GATT is a fairly old treaty itself. It was first ratified in 1947, and it was designed to be a set of treaties aimed at preventing the sort of trade disputes that facilitated or led to the Second World War. And so the GATT was meant to be a part, meant to go along with the IMF and a labor agreement. In fact, what happened is it was signed by a small number of countries in 1947, and no institutional apparatus was established to kind of administer the GATT, or a very small institutional apparatus. But over the years, over the next about 50 years, more and more countries signed on to it. So that in 1994, these countries signed what's called the Marrakesh Agreement of 1994, which brought into existence the World Trade Agreement, which had a set of treaties that it administers and a set of institutions that are pretty robust. All right, so I just want to scroll through this, and this is just a hot link to the WTO texts. And this is the set of agreements that signatories to the Marrakesh Agreement kind of agree to follow. And if you just scroll down here, you can see that there's quite a number of them. So under Annex 1, right there at the top, you have the GATT 1994. And the first note you see there is must be read with GATT 1947. And so what that is the GATT 1947 is kind of the core of that agreement. And then there's some notes added to it. But you also have a set of other treaties with respect to agriculture, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, textiles, clothing. You have rules on pre-shipment inspection. You have rules on what you do about subsidies and countervailing measures. And so we won't click on any of those, but I just wanted everyone here to see just how much legal language there is to maybe be familiar with. And if you're a law scholar like me, play around with and kind of enjoy learning. Okay, and so the first thing I want to talk about here with respect to the general agreement on tariffs and trade is the tariff end of things. And a tariff is a fee paid to gain right of access. And you'll see the word tariff show up in obviously international trade law, but also in utility law a lot. So if you go and do more exploratory and in-depth study of how the electrical grid works, you'll run into tariffs a lot. And the tariffs at the grid level are the fees paid that people pay in order to access the grid. In our case, the tariffs are the fees paid for an importer to get access to the domestic economy of the country. And the way that the GATT works with respect to tariff is it asks every country signatory to the GATT to set out what's called a harmonized tariff schedule. Here I've reduced that to HTS, harmonized tariff schedule. And the harmonized tariff schedule is a publication, and it tells other countries what that country is going to charge to have a particular good imported. And so what I've excerpted here for you is the very first page of the US harmonized tariff schedule. And so it's in alphabetical order, and that's live animals, or animals, comma, live, and animals, comma, products. Just take a quick look at this. And in the left-hand column, you've got a number, a sequence of numbers that designate the good. And I just want to point out just how differentiated those numbers are. There's a lot of ways to distinguish goods. In that big column, you see the article description. In the next column, unit of quantity. And in the three right-hand columns, you see the schedule, the rates of duties for imports. And the way the harmonized tariff schedules work with respect to what's called a tariff binding is it sets out the lower end and the upper end of the tariff that country may charge. So in column under rates duty, you see column 1, and that's divided into general and special. And so general is the lower end of the tariff binding. And then you see column 2 and that's the upper end of the tariff binding. So you can go through here and you can see the article description for the first article is live horses, comma, asses, mules, and hinds. And then a subdivision of animals called horses, and a subdivision of that called purebred breeding animals. And those are distinguished between the males and the females. And then other types of horses, and in particular, those horses imported for immediate slaughter. And you can see there's no tariff on the pure breeding animals. It's free at both the general and in the second class. But if you're importing a horse other than a pure breeding horse, you could have a tariff binding anywhere between free and 2%, 20%, I'm sorry. And then for the column of live horses, asses, mules, and hinds subdivision asses, you can see the tariff binding on that is 6.8% up to 15%. And then that middle column there, that is the column of countries with which we've signed a free trade agreement. And the free trade agreement has dropped the tariff binding on that article on asses. And so I think it's wonderful that one of our trade partners has the, is signified by a plus right there at the beginning. So important parts about the tariffs here. First thing is one, the border carbon adjustment is different than a tariff. So when you have an audience that is kind of a lay audience and you think they might know what a tariff is, you might feel free to use the word tariff. But if you use the word tariff while you're talking about the border carbon adjustment with a trade law lawyer, their eyeballs will pop out of their heads and they'll go, what, you're going to violate the harmonized tariff schedule? So the first point there is just be careful about which words you're using for which audiences. And the second point here is to just note how finely differentiated the different articles are. And this will be very helpful to us in designing a border carbon adjustment. I just looked up the harmonized tariff schedule on steel, and it makes a wonderful, absolutely wonderful number of distinctions between different types of steel that might be imported into the United States. And from that, I think we'll be able to read back and gather the various data we need for administering the border carbon adjustment. So yes, the answer to both those questions is yes. So the harmonized tariff schedule, the format for those don't have to be necessarily the same. So every once in a while, you'll get a case where one country identifies an article as one thing, and another country's harmonized tariff schedule identifies it as another thing. And then there might be a dispute as to which category that goes into. And then yes, the publication and administration of the harmonized tariff schedule has enough flexibility in it that countries can still protect various of their industries if they're so interested in doing. Okay, so one thing about the GATT and with respect to treaties generally is they speak of disciplines here rather than law or positive law. And so one of the disciplines in the GATT is Article 1, and it has the title Most Favored Nation. And that's a funny way to put it, but any country that has signed the GATT is Most Favored Nation status. So it basically distinguishes between those who have signed the GATT and those who haven't. And there's a lot of verbiage in Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the GATT. Basically, this says, I'm going to paraphrase this. You might want to read it later. But the paraphrase here is that if a country treats the imports from another country in a certain way, it has to treat that same, it has to treat the products imported from a third country the same way. All right, so let me give you an example. So if the United States has a tariff of 5% on apples imported from New Zealand, and it also imports apples from Europe, it has to have the same tariff binding on apples, whether they're imported from New Zealand or from Europe. So a country can construct its own harmonized tariff schedule, but it can't treat the imports from different countries differently, which is a next discipline of relevance to us. That's GATT Article 3. and this is national treatment. This one's a little shorter, so I'm going to read it. The products of the territory of any contracting party imported into the territory of any other contracting party shall not be subject, directly or indirectly, to internal taxes or other internal charges of any kind in excess of those applied directly or indirectly to like domestic products. And that underlining is for me because that phrase will become important to us in constructing the border carbon adjustment. And so the paraphrase of this language is, if a country treats a product in one way internally, it has to treat that same product from another country the same way. So if there's an excise tax on steel, for instance, domestic to the United States can't have a separate excise tax on steel from Italy or China. So the TAT is trying to harmonize the internal regulatory and tax structure amongst trading partners. I want to say a little less about the general exceptions. This is Article 20. But what Article 20 allows a country to do is to put up some sort of trade measure. In our case, the potential trade measure would be the border carbon adjustment. And it allows that if that measure in some way violates a previous discipline, such as most favored nation or national treatment, it might still be valid under trade law if it meets one of these general exceptions. And so the language here is Article 20B and G. And so there's an exception for a trade law measure that potentially violates most favored nation or national treatment status if that measure is, quote, necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, or if it is relating to the conservation of an exhaustible natural resource, if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. And so the argument here before the trade law panel, if it were necessary, would be that a border carbon adjustment in conjunction with a domestic carbon tax is necessary to protect human, animal, plant life, or health. And you need to canvass that in some legalese, but anyone on this call could kind of run that argument as to why mitigation or carbon tax are necessary to protect human, animal life, or plant and health. So that in one way is pretty intuitive. Okay, Brett, let's
One quick question as I
yeah.
switch over, just a terminology question. What is an excise tax, Ross?
So an excise tax is usually understood as a tax that is applied on a good or service. So it's sales tax, but it could also appear in other forms. Sales tax is ad valorem, but some of these are per weight or per unit, but an excise tax. So I want to talk about the process when two countries are having a tiff about trade law products. How do they go about under the WTO rules, kind of resolving their differences? So, and this is going to be very brief. It gets more complicated in this, but the first thing that happens under the WTO rules is there has to be a consultation. So the country which is saying there is some sort of violation of trade law will put together a meeting with the country they're accusing of violating the trade law, and they'll sit down and chat. And if they don't agree in a way to resolve their differences, then they can file a petition before an arbitration panel that's set up by the WTO. The arbitration panel has 3 folks, and after that panel makes a decision, it can go to an appellate board, which reviews the panel, and then after the appellate board hears the case, the decision is circulated by the dispute settlement body to all member countries. Now, the panel will issue a holding, and the non-compliant nation state, that is, the panel might say, yes, United States, you are violating the trade laws. You can come into compliance with what we think is the interpretation of the trade laws. And if the violating country does that, then all is well and good. But if the non-compliant nation state decides that it doesn't want to follow the directions of the panel, then the other country can implement what is called trade remedies. A countervailing duty, for instance, and what counts as um, and the different types of trade remedies is pretty complicated, but we're going to skip over that and just note that when a country decides to implement a trade remedy, the WTO retains supervision over that trade remedy to make sure it's equivalent or fair. And so one of the questions that comes up is from members of Congress is, will China or will India or will some other country actually follow the WTO ruling? And if they don't, won't it start a trade war? And a good possible answer to that is no more so than when in other cases where a country has imposed a trade remedy. The WTO will keep supervision over countervailing duties and whatnot. And so long as you think that is a process that helps avoid trade wars, then I don't think there'll be too much difference here. Now, with respect to the arbitration process, with one important exception, arbitration is always between nation states. And for the United States, this means that the Department of Commerce is the agency which runs the trade law side of things. Private parties are allowed to petition the Department of Commerce to initiate a consultation. So for instance, in Wisconsin right now, the paper manufacturers have gotten together and petitioned the Department of Commerce saying that Nova Scotia, the province of Canada, has various subsidies in place that violate the trade law. And the Department of Commerce has commenced that arbitration. Oh yeah, and so basically the consultation arbitration process takes place between nation states or the designated agency of that nation state. Okay, so we're about halfway through, and what I want to do is take some of that general trade law facts and try to apply them to the border carbon adjustment. So on the national treatment side, we had that phrase, no tax in excess requirement. And so what this means is on the domestic side, you'd have a a carbon fee, and the carbon fee is actually on carbon dioxide emissions, carbon dioxide pollution. And so the in excess requirement under national treatment means that the border carbon adjustment has to be on the carbon dioxide emissions embodied in the imported product. Otherwise, you're not taxing the same thing, and you'll be violating the in excess requirement here. And so this means what most of these border carbon adjustments end up looking like is they separate fossil fuels from other products, and then they separate emission intensive trade exposed products from other products. And the emission intensive trade exposed products are sometimes called carbon intensive products. And so so in the next slides, we're going to see how that would work out for fossil fuels. And then after this, we'll do carbon intensive products. So data on border carbon adjustment and fossil fuels. Have we got data? So our friendly state of California has implemented something called the low carbon fuel standard. And what this standard, the short of it is that fuel blenders in the state of California are required to kind of blend their fuel in such a way that it meets a certain carbon intensity, which is expressed in grams of carbon dioxide emitted per megajoule of energy in the fuel. And to figure out what the carbon intensity of particular fuels are, the California California Air Regulatory Board, used something called the GREET model, which is the Greenhouse Gases Regulatory Emissions and Energy Use in Transportation. And this is an extensive spreadsheet that attempts to track not only the carbon dioxide emissions in the fuel itself, but in the process emissions. So those emissions which occurred in the processing of various fuels. So just to give you one example of the detail here, the GREET model picks out the processing emissions that occurred in processing ethanol in various states in the country because of the electrical power they used at the facility in producing the ethanol. So it's amazingly uh, amazing amount of detail. And so one thing this means is California has put out this table of the carbon intensity of imported petroleum. And I've excerpted an example here. And so you can see the country and the state from which the fossil fuel is originating. Angola, Brazil, our friends, Canada. And then they're named again. I love the names on these various tables. So you have the Access Western Blend, High Prairie Bitumen, Curl Lake, something called Coke, Alberta, Light Sweet. And then you can see the carbon intensity. And I think you can probably pick out the blends here, which are tar sands or bitumen. So Albanian heavy synthetic has a very high carbon intensity, almost 21 grams of carbon dioxide emitted per megajoule. And so you can, and if you were, say, playing the market with respect to fuels and you knew a carbon tax was coming online, you would know which blenders and which fuel producers to short and which to play long. So anyway, the point here is that we have the data to identify the carbon dioxide content of imported fossil fuels. Okay, so what makes a product carbon intensive? And the way that this works, beginning with the Waxman-Markey bill, is you take a product and you try to determine what proportion of its production costs are attributable to energy. And you also attempt to determine what portion of that article is traded internationally. And when a product is above both the cutoff line for energy intensity and trade exposure, it's labeled a carbon intensive good. And I've put two numbers here in parentheses. So it's pretty common to say on the energy intensity side, we'll say 5%. If more than 5% of the cost of the product are attributable to energy, then it meets that standard. And on the trade side, it's common to say 15%. So if more than 15% of the good is traded internationally, then it meets the trade exposure criteria. And some examples here are just the things you'd kind of expect intuitively: iron, steel, steel mill products, aluminum, cement, glass, so forth. Next slide, please. Okay, and here is, that's hard to read. And so if you wanted to check it out more closely, you might have to blow that up. But what this is the, from the study by the Interagency Task Force, asked by the offices of I guess Waxman to identify which products produced in the United States would meet the emission intensive trade exposed criterion. And so you can see on the bottom is energy intensity, and that produces a vertical line at 5% of, and then you see on the horizontal line at about 15%. You see the two thresholds of energy intensity and trade exposure. Yep, very good. Thanks, Brett. And everything kind of to the left and below that line is not a carbon intensive good, and everything to the right and north is trade exposed. And the size of the bubble is the magnitude of the sector's emissions. So it's possible to be carbon intensive, but to not actually have, not to be actually producing that much emissions. And you get the usual suspects in this list. It's hard to read, but plastics, synthetic rubber, steel is in there, paper, pulp mill is in there. But then you get some interestingly non-intuitive stuff. So at the top of the list is malt manufacturing, and the second on the list is wet corn milling. And the third is rendering and meat byproduct processing. So all those have smallish footprints, but there they are. So that's how you would identify carbon intensive products. Okay, a couple more things here to be cognizant of. There is a WTO case called U.S. shrimp turtles, and the way that the WTO names its cases is the title of the country that is accused of being in violation of trade law, and then some catchy name about what that is about. And so in this case, U.S. shrimp turtles, the United States had used this is the Endangered Species Act actually, and in the Department of Congress had issued a regulation saying that if you have caught shrimp and you have not used a turtle exclusion device, then you can't import those shrimp. And the legitimation of that was turtles are, these sea turtles are endangered. And the panel heard this case and they said, this is put roughly, but I think accurately enough, and they said, the United States, you're in violation of the trade law agreement here for two reasons. The first is you're allowed to have trade measures that are responsive to domestic environmental concerns like this, but you've done two things wrong here. The first is you have required fishers of shrimp around the world to use this one technological device called the turtle exclusion device. And you've not given them any latitude to choose other ways to reduce harm to turtles. So that was the first thing that was wrong. Second thing the United States did wrong is it started to engage in negotiations with other countries about the shrimp turtle problem, but it didn't engage with all countries in a fair way. And so one, I think, pretty strong reading of the U.S. shrimp turtles case is that if you're going to use a border measure in this way, you've got to allow other countries to find solutions for themselves that work for their country, and you got to be doing negotiations to make sure that it's not just a unilateral imposition. Okay, yeah, so with respect to the border carbon adjustment, there's got to be some way to kind of credit or take account of other countries' mitigation efforts. There's got to be some way to suspend the border carbon adjustment when the importing country has kind of has at least equivalent, is a common phrase, at least equivalent mitigation efforts in place. Okay, and this kind of sums that up. So this should be the BCA, not the BTA, but the BCA encourage other countries to implement their own carbon prices. We'll see here in a little bit, a lot of countries already have carbon prices, and the United States is standing a little bit alone now. And the best thing it looks like is to have a border carbon adjustment go up, but then use diplomacy to resolve the details and hopefully find solutions that actually enhance a mitigation. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And one of those possible, one of the ideas floating around there for enhancing mitigation effort is called the Carbon Club. And this would kind of be an equivalent of a free trade area or a customs union, where all the countries who want to price carbon and to mitigate greenhouse gases could kind of harmonize their mitigation efforts together. And in particular, I think the NAFTA territories offers an absolutely wonderful forum for incorporating carbon pricing and other mitigation efforts. And when I spoke with the Canadian MP about a year ago now, he was one of the things he told me is he was really hoping that the mitigation efforts of Canada and the United States could be integrated, just because our economies are so well integrated. And in fact, the Prime Minister of Canada has indicated he'd like to see carbon pricing incorporated into the NAFTA negotiations now ongoing.
Before moving on, Ross, too, connected to that, Kevin asked this great question about, is it possible to apply a border carbon adjustment if an individual state adopted carbon fee and dividend-like program? Would that be necessary to avoid leakage with companies fleeing that state to avoid the tax?
So at the state level?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So so I think the answer is yes. It'd be some tricky legal writing. But at one point, California was considering two different bills one bill got passed, and the one that was probably a little better didn't get passed. And in that one, Michael Wara, professor at Stanford, had introduced the notion of basically an administrative agency on the California side that would use trade data, both internal and external to the United States, to try to figure out which products being imported into California didn't have a carbon price on them, and because they lacked a carbon price, were outcompeting the domestic, i.e. California manufacturing. That was not incorporated into the California bill, but I do think it's possible. And I've been working myself, Kevin, on state level stuff. And I think there is a lot of interesting strategic stuff you can do where a state level carbon price has spillover effects that mimic the border carbon adjustment. So short answer, yes. And this slide is, I think this slide's 2 years old. So I think it's a little dated here. But if you're worried about other countries having some sort of carbon pricing scheme up, there's one country standing out there, and that is the United States. And for this reason, i.e. other countries have carbon pricing up, but the United States doesn't and has indicated its intent to withdraw from Paris, you do hear, in fact, some talking from other countries about imposing a border carbon adjustment on the U.S. So just something to be aware of. And in particular, addressing China. And this slide again is a little dated, but one thing to note here is there's a perception out there that China, and in fact other countries, aren't doing a lot to mitigate, or that their commitments are not genuine. They're getting a free pass. And so that, and the inference being that if the United States did something to mitigate, we'd be kind of disadvantaging ourselves unnecessarily. And so next slide, please. Just a couple of things to think about here with respect to China. So the new development in China, in fact, that there's been other new developments in China since then. But you remember a couple years ago, President Obama did a handshake agreement with the president of China, and China agreed to what ended up being its nationally determined contribution at the Paris Agreement. And so it does in fact have a variety of programs up and ready to go to mitigate. And while they are the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world right now, it's arguable that they're doing more to mitigate than we are. So they have a cap and trade program that's going up. And they have an infrastructure program to bring wind energy from the west of China into the load centers on the east. And those together might be sufficient to kind of match what the US is doing. Okay, so a couple questions here that pop up. Will China follow the trade laws? I think the answer to that is, I believe so, as much as it follows the trade laws in other places. Do we have the data? Yes, and I showed that off to you. It's pretty sexy data. Will it start a trade war? I don't think any more than any other trade dispute. And what about the BCA and non-fossil fuel emissions from, example, deforestation? This is a tricky one and a hard one, right? So the carbon fee is only on the emissions from fossil fuels. So what are we going to do about emissions from agriculture and from land use and just deforestation? And frankly, I don't have the answer to that question right now. And why isn't the border carbon adjustment a tariff? So those have all come up for me. Okay, so a couple of things to take care of. Carbon intensive goods and fossil fuels entering the country are eligible for the border adjustment, that is eligible to have it imposed on them. A properly constructed border carbon adjustment is compliant with the most favored nation disciplines and the national treatment disciplines. And if you say most favored nation and national treatment, some staff members, their eyeballs will light up. They'll think you really know what you're talking about. And then some diplomacy is required to integrate mitigation regimes. And I think
so. For tonight's lesson, if anyone has questions and follow-up, feel free to reach out to me. My email is listed right there. Again, Ross, thank you so much for being on the call and sharing the wisdom that you've had on mitigation policy and all of the international law considerations that you do. And we hope all of you have a wonderful week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place. Thanks, everyone.